Hello there, welcome back to Riverbank Railways. So today what we're going to do is we are going to wire up a three-way point for a SEEP PM point motor. And these are fairly simple to do when you're dealing with an ordinary point, and I'll explain now in a little bit. But the three-way point, you're going to need two SEEP point motors, and if you're just getting started on this, it can look fairly complex on the back. But it is relatively simple, so I will try and explain. Before we go into the points, here's a SEEP point motor, and what you'll get out of the box is this part. And for my personal preference, I prefer there's 6 contacts on the back, and I prefer to wire them into like a little block here, just to make it easier to screw in the wires and not be soldering underneath the baseboard. So what I do is I solder a certain colour from each contact here, A through F, into the block, and that means I can attach the point motor underneath the baseboard and the block and have it sitting there waiting for wiring, and not be worried about trying to solder underneath the baseboard. So if you don't know already, just to explain, there's 2 things going on with the point motor, especially this is a PM1, so it has polarity switch as well. So contacts A and B are green and black here. These are the negative contacts for the point motor itself, and then C is red. So C is providing positive power into the motor, and then A and B are carrying negative power back. And depending on which way you switch your switch on the control panel, A or B will complete the circuit and the point motor will switch left or right. Okay, so that's fairly simple. That's the first part of the point motor. Now where the polarity switch comes into play is when this goes left or right, it will make contact with either D or E in the middle. So what you do is you supply power to D and E, and whichever way this is switched, so let's say D is positive and E is negative, if the point motor switched this way, contacting E, it will send that power back through F, which is this white wire here. So F is coming out of the point motor, and then F will be used. What I use it for is it will power the frog of the point, so it will switch polarity of the frog to either positive or negative, depending on which way the switch is thrown. And I will also bring that power back to the control panel to power either one of an LED. You can check out my other videos on building the control panel. We're not going to worry about that today, but the point being that, no pun, the point being that when the power is supplied to D and E, depending on which way the point motor is switched, that power the polarity will come back through F, and that's what we're talking about today. So when you're doing an ordinary point, Electrofrog point, what you want to do, first of all, is you want to bridge these 2 rails. Here, you want to bridge these 2 rails, and then you want to bridge these 2 rails, and then you want to supply power to them. And what that will do is it means that these rails will be powered, and it won't depend on the contact between the blades to conduct the power, and it gives more reliable running. Most point motors these days, most points these days will have this part broken anyway. And usually what you get is you get a couple of wires just making that connection, so you snip those wires, and then, hopefully you can see this, what you do is you run a little wire between this rail and solder it in, and another little wire between this rail and solder that, and then supply your power to those rails. In my case, brown is positive and blue is negative, and that will come from underneath the baseboard from the bus. So now we have 2 rails, each of which are powered, and then those power lines are also connected to your point motor, and when I was saying before, depending on which way the point motor switched, it will send that power back through F, and we connect our white wire here to F, and that will supply the power in here, and it will power the frog either positive or negative depending on which way the point is thrown. Okay, simple enough. With a 3-way switch, you have 2 point motors and 2 sets of frogs. And the trick here is, if you look at the back, you will see there's a whole bunch of wiring here on this one, but it's only located here, whereas there's a whole bunch of wiring on the right one which covers this frog, but also covers this frog down here. So the point motor, which is attached to here, the back kind of switch if you like, only controls this frog up here. The point motor that is attached to here controls this frog and this frog. And so that's important to remember, because on a three-way switch you have two sets of wires coming out. So it's important to remember which one is which when you're putting the point motor on. So we have two things to do. One is we are going to cut these wires and attach our own insulated wire, because these will be travelling down through the baseboard, so we want to insulate them, and then they will be then connected back to our point motors. And the other thing we want to do on a three-way switch is these rails are actually insulated themselves, there's no breaks, so that's okay. But what we want to do is we want to connect this rail and this rail and this rail with power, and then we want to connect this rail and this rail and this rail with power. And that means that the power will not rely on the contacts between the blades down here. Whatever power we supply to this rail will also be powered here and across here. And on a three-way switch they make it a little bit more difficult, because this point here, there's two little gold contacts here, if you can see them. And what we need, that's the inner rail, and we need to connect it to this rail and this rail. And these two are covered by plastic, so we have to chip away and cut off this plastic. Then we have to solder a wire going from here, which makes contact in the middle, and then makes contact with the outer. And then the same over here. So it's a little bit more tricky, but it's definitely doable. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start off. So hopefully that explanation was good. We're going to cut away the plastic down here. So here. And you have to be careful not to damage the rail as well, obviously. Can be very daunting to do if you haven't done it before, or if you're nervous. All I can say is kind of maybe if you have some old points or something like that, just practice on them first, or else take the plunge. Okay, let's see how we're doing here. So I just skipped ahead there a little bit. It is a bit finicky, so there's no point in watching that part. So what you can see here now is there's our middle rail, there's our inner rail and our middle rail and our outer rail. They all are exposed, which means we can connect the wire across them. I'm going to do the same on the other one now, so we'll skip forward on that. Remember as well, this is underneath, so you can't really see it. So make it as tight as you can, but you don't have to be too finicky. Yeah, you can see here, see? So we have our three rails exposed, and we will cut a wire that's going to join across these. Okay, now that that's done, you can see our wires here. What we need now is we're going to cut these two wires. These are quite long coming out of the point, so we're going to cut them up around here, and then we can use this metal to form our contacts. other things to watch for as well, which I've just done. So it's a good case in point. When you're dealing with these wires, they're quite finicky, so if you pull too hard they will come away from the rail. So what I'm going to have to do now is solder that back to the rail. There we go. So we're soldered back on there and everyone's happy. Okay, so grab a piece of this wire here that you've just cut off. And what you need to do is you make a little kind of a long W shape. So you're going to have two little bits sticking up at the end, and then the wire will span the three rails. So you're going to need roughly, where's our contacts? Here they are here. So you can see here we're going to need roughly that amount to span them, and then we solder the three contacts. So again, it can take a little trial and error. So we just bend up a little bit. I'll show you the shape now when it's done. You do need a bit of patience for this, so. Okay, so if you can see that, that's what you're going for. So let's place that on and see that we have a good fit. And we do. It's slightly too long on the ends. So we're going to nip off a tiny bit of the ends, otherwise it'll get tricky. There we go. So again, just to show you, that's what you're looking for. Hard to focus on this, it's a tiny thing, it's a tiny piece of wire, so what I usually do is place it across the rails, which is finicky in itself. There we go. Yeah. What you want to do is solder one end in place first, put a little bit of flux on it. So once one end is soldered in place, it gets a lot easier. And when you're putting the flux on it, try and hold it in place because the flux will stick to it. Here we go. Yeah. I appreciate it's tricky to see this on the video. I'll show you the end result now in a second. see here, what I've done is soldered the inner rail here, see? And now we want to solder these two pieces. There we go. Don't be afraid to test it either, because if it's going to break, you'd rather it break now than when it's on the layout. This is what we're talking about. So you can see here, see, 1, 2, 3. So that piece of wire is now connecting these 3 rails. And we're going to do the same on the opposite side. I'll skip forward now and you can see it in a second. Okay, I've soldered the other piece. So you can see now we have 3 rails on this side are connected, 3 rails on that side are connected. So now what we need to do is solder our power wires to the outside rails on each side. So 1 here and 1 here. These will provide power to the rails, all 3 rails on each side. Important thing to remember is which power rail goes where. So I know that in my layout, this rail here is going to be the positive or brown rail. So the brown is on the right. So grab a piece of your wire, whatever you're using, and just trim off just a little bit. You don't need much. Give it a twist. And what you want to do, I do this just to give maximum contact, just bend the top of it slightly, so that you have as much of the wire in contact with the rail. And then maybe trim it just a tiny bit. There you go. So that's what you're looking for there. See that little shape? If you think about, your point is going to be sitting like this on top, so you want it like that. Do the same with the opposite one. Now, if you tin the ends of the wires, it makes things easier. So just put a bit of flux on it. So if you have solder on the wires and solder on the rail, then all you have to do is heat them up. You know. So just hold your wire against the rail. connection. And there we go. Oops, rails are still a bit hot, so you can see here. So we just soldered our power wires to our rails here. And what I'm going to do is we're going to test this at the end, so I'm just going to trim off these so that I can connect my multimeter to them. You don't need to do this, but you might as well test now before you start putting it underneath the baseboard. Okay, we'll do that in a second. Last job. We now need to throw some of our, I use white for my frog wire, so just solder some white wire onto this. We can actually make these a bit shorter. The shorter these are, the less likely they are to break. And then we'll put some heat shrink on it as well. So. White wire. Now, remember, this wire has to reach all the way from here to wherever your point motor is. Bearing in mind you're going to have 2 point motors, and in my case I have a block on them, so just you need to keep that in mind. I know that my point motors are going to be connected like this, so one of my blocks is going to be around here and the other one is going to be down here, so one of the wires is going to have to reach to here and the other is all the way back to here. So generally I would cut a length of wire that will somewhere around that length there. So let's go through it. And same, we're going to need 2, remember. And again, because we're going to need to test this, just trim off the other end as well, just for testing purposes. Okay, tin them up. And solder them on. It's not going on, so I'm going to put some flux onto the actual wire here as well. There we go, good contact there. Cool. As I said before, don't be afraid to pull it and break the connection. Because if it's weak, it'll give. We're going to put a little bit of heat shrink on that because, see, we're connected there now. This is going through your baseboard, so just to protect it and keep everyone happy and insulated. A bit thinner. I try not to use the tip when you're doing the heat shrink because you get some residue off the rubber and it can make the tip of the soldering iron really dirty. You also have to be careful not to get too close to the bottom of the track plastic, as I'm doing, because you'll just melt it, which is not good either. Nearly there. Here we go. Again, another trick I learned after doing the heat shrink, just give them a test as well, because sometimes the heat from the soldering iron can melt the solder you just made. So, voila. Our two frog wires are here, and our two power wires are here. When we put this on the baseboard now, you would connect, obviously these are going to supply power, and we need to test those connections. So get your multimeter, like so, and set it to the diode symbol, because this will test is there a connection or not. One obviously is no connection, and as it gets closer to 0, that means you have a connection. So what we want to do is test each of our wires and make sure that we have a good connection. I think I found it. Yeah, that one comes down. Okay, so this blue wire, if we put one connector or one probe here and just hold it against the wire, this is why we strip the wire. The other probe, once we touch each of the rails, should show a connection. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, there we go. So if we touch this outer rail, yep. We touch the inner, the middle rail, yep. And the inner rail, yep. There we go. So that means our power is connected, and I'm just to be thorough, just without touching the wire, I'm just going to test the rails have a connection to each one. And there. Cool. So that one is good. And we test our brown one. Outer rail, middle rail, inner rail. Perfect. Cool. So our power rails are all good. Now we'll test our frogs. So let's see, we've got our probe here. So remember, our top left frog is on its own, and then these ones are connected. So one end to the wire, and one end to each rail in the frog. Yep. 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 All good. Black probe, there it is. And we're at one rail. Yep. 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 Yes. should be onto these rails as well. Yep. No connection there, that's okay. Excellent. So that's what we wanted to see. And there we have it. So, what I would do now is, if you think about it, hopefully I'll explain this. Our power wires, our power from our bus is going to come into D and E, and then it's going to come from there into, sorry, these are also connected to D and E, so it will bring power up to the track. And then because they're also connected to D and E, they will bring power in through F when that's switched, and then F will come to our frog and switch the polarity of the different rails. And then F will also go back to our LEDs. The only thing you need to watch for is to make sure you have it connected the right way when you put these switches on. So remember that this wire here connected to this frog is going back to whatever switch is on the back one. This wire on this frog is coming to the near switch here, and then you need to connect up the A and B for throwing the point the correct way. You can figure it out, but you know, you have a 50-50 chance of getting it right the first time. So just connect it up, see if it works, and you might have to switch it around. But that's why using the blocks is very handy, because if you do need to change it, it's very simple. You don't have to unsolder or anything like that. I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned something from it. Feel free to comment and add your own thoughts or your own ways of doing it. And I'll see you in the next one.